the other thing that's good to know, it's good to do, welcome to the Brentwood webinar on Harmony with Strengths, Understanding the Regulatory Reform in China. My name is Lucy Xiao, and I'm the consultant in Asia, offering Asia services. Now, first I would like to briefly introduce you to Brentwood Biomedical and what we do. So as a regulatory consulting firm, our service covers both medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices. With offices in Beijing as well as Sydney and around Australia, we actually focus on the Asia-Pacific region in providing you regulatory strategy, pre-market submission, as well as post-market compliance. 30 minutes is obviously a very short time to go through the whole of Chinese regulatory system and everything you need to know. So what I have put together here are 3 key areas where China is enforcing harmony, and also with 3 key areas where they're ramping up the regulatory strengths. This is now intended to give you the flavor and direction of where China is heading, rather than a document checklist that you may want for a particular registration or variation that you wish to conduct. Now, of course, how the rules and regulations apply to each individual device can always differ from case to case, and we may have a chance of discussing that in more detail in the question and answers section at the end of the 30-minute presentation here. But without further ado, I'll just introduce you to the topics that we're covering today. So under the Harmony flag, we have how China is establishing Chinese national and industrial standards in order to bring standardization to its device market, how China is bringing streamlining to its administrative processes, and the way they're now clarifying the risk classification system, which is always the first step of any regulatory submission. On the other side, under the strengths area, they have made certain adjustments to the clinical data requirements. There is now a new fast-track review pathway for innovative devices, and there are also a lot of post-market requirements coming up, which you have to observe after getting your registration through. So why don't we start by setting the scene here? China is the 4th largest market in the world in medical device area. In September 2013, that was estimated worth about US $17 billion. It also has probably the fastest growing trend, with about 20% per annum growth forecasted for the next 5 years. And forget about Obamacare. The Chinese government has invested $124 billion into its healthcare reform system. And that was only phase 1 of the program. We have already seen over 95% of universal health insurance. In a country with the largest population, now that's some achievement. And right now we're in phase 2 of the healthcare reform, with another additional $63.5 billion to be invested into the system by the year 2020. Now, who here remembers the Beijing Olympics? I'm not going to go into any detail of the opening ceremony or any particular games, but just to give you a flavor of how much effort China poured into preparation for the Olympic Games. In order to make foreigners feeling more welcomed, all restaurants in Beijing were required to translate their menu into English. So here we have 4 dishes to whet your appetite. Any takers for Shiguo black pepper cowboy meat? Unfortunately, as you can see, the dish name here are quite amusing, but not as informative as intended. That is, until someone came up with this brilliant idea of using pictographics, so elements of the raw ingredients, to convey what actually went into the dish. And here what you see is what you get. Simple, isn't it? A pig nose for pork and an omelette for eggs. Now, isn't that clever? So what's that to do with medical devices, I hear you ask? the same principle applies. China is making every effort it can in seeking the best way to bring itself to the world stage of international harmonization, in conditionings as well as in its medical device regulations. Now, this is actually quite evident in the way that China has joined formally the IMDRF in 2013. The IMDRF, called International Medical Device Regulators Forum, has taken over the GHTF, which is formerly the Global Harmonization Task Force, but they hold the same mission of accelerating the international medical device regulatory harmonization and convergence. Since joining this company, China has lost no time in harmonizing the regulatory processes with the publishing of a whole series of guidance documents and draft for comment guidance documents in the past 12 months, which we'll go into a bit more detail in this webinar. But the most recent and probably the most important of these revisions is the revision on the regulation for the supervision and management of medical devices. Now, this is actually the top-tier regulation in China that governs everything pre-market, post-market that you do with your medical device. But unfortunately, as of today, when I checked, the full text version still has not yet been made publicly available. So from the child guidance documents that we will be discussing, you can have a glimpse into what is probably the trend and intention of this top regulation, but a lot of the details will be knotted out once we can read the full text version of this. So to begin, I thought I'll lead you through a typical registration pathway. So you may not be having done this before, or you may have done this hundreds of times, but to start with, because of the requirements in China is to have the registration of any imported device, that is, to have the registration in your country of origin. That means EC certificate if you are a European manufacturer, or any other US, you need a 510K and so on and so forth. So most devices would have an existing technical file or device master file, and this document needs to be translated into Chinese for the compilation of your regulatory dossier. And the most important part of this dossier is called the product standard dossier. So this document is also referred to as the product registration standards. The reason this dossier is very important is because it contains a list of standards that you have applied, such as biocompatibility or electrical safety, depending on the type of your product. You also put in the product description, such as your intended use, the functionality of your device, and the composition of your device. It should also cover the specifications, covering all aspects of biological, physical, and chemical properties, as well as the testing method you use to verify the specifications are met. To wrap it all up, you also have the packaging method included, as well as the storage and transportation requirements. So the next step, the third step of in-China type testing, is actually conducted mandatory for Class 2 and 3 device, of course, in accordance with your product standard dossier. So the testing report you get from your in-China testing house is then combined with other technical as well as administrative documents for submission to the China Food and Drug Administration, the CFDA. Now that's the name of the regulatory competent authority in China. So this submission must pass both the technical as well as the administrative review and approval process for you to obtain finally the Chinese medical device registration certificate. Currently, this certificate would be valid for 4 years, but possibly we'll see that extended to 5 in the new regulation that's coming out. So here I've put some indicative timelines, which when you add them all up, the working days and the translation times and so on and so forth, would total about 9 months of your time on the calendar. However, for those of you that had the privilege of going through this cycle for Class 2 and 3 devices, you probably think, oh, that's too good to be true. And that is what most manufacturers find in China. because the biggest factor of delay is right here in the technical evaluation process. Now, typical to technical reviews around the world, what happens is the manufacturer submits to the competent authority with a nicely packaged submission dossier. After review, the reviewer would come back with a list of questions and ask for further clarification. The US 510K review process pretty much follows the same framework. However, there are some horror stories that we hear when this cycle of question and answer goes on and on and on. And to give you a bit of an extreme case, we did have a client that come to us with a Class 3 application, which was initially lodged in 2009. But by the time they came to us in 2012, the application was still firmly stuck in this cycle of question and answer. Now, a 3-year delay to your market plan is not going to make any manufacturers happy. But there is good news in that CFDA also sees this as a problem. So in order to give more predictability into this registration timeline, from June 2013, with the publication of this new guidance on technical review, the reviewers are actually restrained to one single set of review questions, with never more than one supplementary round of submission from the manufacturer to clarify on the initial questions asked. Now, this also restrains the manufacturer to answer the questions in 60 working days, or possibly 120 if you apply for an extension, but it does give a more definitive timeline towards a shorter application review process. But that is not all, because remember, your certificate that you get at the end of the pre-market registration is valid for a set amount of years. So towards the end of that validity period, you'll need to apply for re-registration or renewal to the CFDA. What used to happen is China has a very stringent requirements on re-registration. You can say almost more stringent than the initial registration process. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of manufacturers, because if they had good market feedback, that is no significant adverse events happening, and they made relatively few changes to the product, it seems to be spending a lot of resources from the CFDA and also from the manufacturer in pulling together the re-registration all over again, doing all the type testing and putting all the translation files and things. So now what is what this new simplified way allow you to do is, for certificate renewal and certain simple variations, you're no longer required to do full product type testing. And that can save you months from the registration timeline, as well as cut the queue on the testing houses in China, which from our experience has already starting to see a steady queue building up because of the number of biocompatibility and physical chemical testing they have to do. So besides the streamlining of the initial and re-registration process, China has also adopted the collective wisdom from the Western industry in its effort to establish recognized national and international and industrial standards for medical devices. So here we see the government agencies, such as CFDA, leading the conversion of certain Western standards into Chinese. Here the example is GB 16886, which is the medical device biocompatibility standards, and that is the equivalent, and it is identical to the ISO 10993 series, which I guess the European manufacturer will be quite familiar with. Now, as a non-Chinese manufacturer, you actually refer to all the national and industrial standards in your own product-specific product standards that were mentioned earlier for registration and type testing purpose. However, there is a catch here that the Chinese standards are not always the most recent version of their international counterpart. A classic example of this is your IEC 60601 electrical safety standard, where China is still using the second edition, and the rest of the world, as we know, have moved on to the third edition, or is moving towards the third edition. And that creates a problem because even though I'm not a technical expert here, but I understand that if you develop your product solely under the third edition, you often have trouble in meeting testing requirements that's drafted under the second edition. So this can give you a lot of grief when you cannot pass type testing in China and having to explain why you don't meet certain electrical safety requirements. So it's very valuable for manufacturers to watch out for these regulatory landmines, as we call them, as early as you can in the device lifecycle. Ideally, you can catch them in the R&D phase of your product because the cost of redesigning can be quite astronomical. Now thirdly, and this is another point of confusion that often comes from the device classification system. So similar, I guess, to Europe, China does have a classification rule. So that sets up a three-tiered risk classification-based system where Class 1 is the lowest risk and Class 3 is the highest risk. But it also integrated the US category-based system in a whole series of different categories of devices that try to classify and give examples for. Now, to make matters further complicated, because of the way that technology development always leads the update of regulation, China has also been in the habit of publishing case-by-case classification consultation decisions it made from the submission it received from manufacturers. So that becomes an issue when the most up-to-date case-by-case consultation definition is submitted by individual manufacturers who understandably does not have the regulator's way of thinking. So two devices manufactured by different manufacturer but quite similar can have very, very different indications. And it is not the manufacturer's job to write watertight and unambiguous intended use to help their competitors down the track to classify similar devices. So this presents a real challenge when new manufacturers come in and have to interpret the different categories, rules, and case-by-case consultation to come up with their own definition or own classification before they can proceed further in this device application process. Now, to tidy up this mess and to equip itself with more technically challenged work in the coming decade, China actually published a new draft revision on the classification rules last December. So in this draft, we have seen the introduction of IVD reagents. We have seen a clarification of standalone software, active implantable device, as well as medical dressings. We also have seen a further defined clarification for medical device kits, and also some modification to the principle for the classification of accessories. Now, with the revision of rules come the revision of certain catalogs. So this is supposed to tidy up the practice of multiple consultation outcome applying to similar, if not identical, devices. So instead of, turning either to Class 1 or Class 2 or Class 3, hopefully the manufacturers coming now into China will have a straightforward one-way system with a consolidated classification catalog. So now moving on to the three measures that are taken to strengthen the regulatory practice in China. Here we have the clinical data requirements for overseas imported device. Now, for the past few years, we have seen Class 2 and 3 devices both able to use the overseas clinical data that they submitted in the market of origin to apply for in-China registration. And in the past 12 months, we have seen a few Class 2s, selected Class 2s, because of the lower risk they convey, being exempted from submit further clinical data if they want to register in China, where the expectation is certain high-risk class 3s, for example, the absorbable or active implantable devices, may in the future need in-China clinical trials before they can before they can get through the pre-market registration. So this is very different for devices from what's the case for IVD reagents, which for class 1, the clinical data requirement is exempted. But for class 2 and 3, they have to have in-China data with a set amount of sample and a set amount level of hospitals where the samples are taken and trials conducted. So now we have talked a lot about theory. I thought it's good to bring a bit more practicality to this by give you a bit of a case study of a recent case we have experienced in China. So here I should start by mentioning this technicality of the classification rule, where the skin in the classification rule in the newly published draft is defined as uncompromised surface only. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the ISO 10993 standards, you know that in biocompatibility testing, there are 3 subcategories of skin. You can have intact surface, you can have mucosal surface, and you can also have compromised surface. So for this medical dressing registration we're doing in China, because it's a class 3 wound dressing, which means it's high risk, we have the reviewer coming to us requesting additional biocompatibility testing done in China, which we thought are only typical of implants. So that's an interesting case, and we got talking to the reviewer and try to understand her line of thinking, and her line of argument basically is leaning on the side of caution. If you're high risk, then you need to do more than what testing needs to be applied to uncompromised surface. So the issue underlying here is obviously training for the reviewers. As they see a lot of new guidelines and new documents, they need to really understand how to integrate them with existing standards and how to apply the different definitions in different cases together. But it's kind of expected because a lot of changes are happening, as we all see, and the reviewers are trying hard, or trying their best they can to catch up on what needs to happen moving forward. So we have also seen, as previously mentioned, some new fast-track method of reviewing innovative devices. And this is an effort by China, well, across China, to bring more innovation and protection for IP. So in this, we see that if your device is first of its kind in China, holding an invention patent, and you have applied full design control, have evidence of DHF, a device history file as well, then you can enjoy certain privileges in China. Now that includes you can have a single contact person to manage the pre-market consultation as well as the actual review process. You get advanced feedback from the in-China testing house on the technical aspect of your product. And if your device is so innovative it doesn't have an existing classification category, you can have the category and classification decided in parallel with the technical review. Also, you get VIP treatment because your application dossier is going to be reviewed by a special team of experts appointed by the Office of Innovative Devices. And you obviously get priority over the other common types of application submitted. Excuse me. So with that, we have seen some scandals in the West, such as the PIP breast implant and post-market issues, which brought all regulators' attention to emphasizing the role of compliance, of ongoing compliance. Now, CFDA is not to be excluded from that. So up until recently, China has adopted what I call an Angry Bird model in its regulatory framework, which means you have a heavy reliance on the initial part, in the initial shot you get. So for those of you who are not addicted to mobile phone games, I should do a bit of explaining here. You win the game of Angry Bird by carefully positioning the ammunition, which is the little bird item here you see on the left, on this slingshot. And you fire them across the screen to where this crosses, so hit the chosen targets here. And once you have hit all the targets that you've chosen, then similarly, like, carefully prepared pre-market dossiers answer all the questions of the CFDA reviewer, you win the game or win the approval to market. However, moving forward, CFDA doesn't like this. Everything is either a shot or a miss. They don't want just to have a one-shot only approach. But instead, they want to upgrade their game to a Flappy Bird model, where this is another mobile game where you need to react to ongoing challenges in the environment, such as all the pillars you see on the way here. And this is very similar to manufacturers who need to continue to observe the post-market regulatory requirements to keep their device safe and effective. Of course, if you only focus on the initial moves, the formal Angry Bird model takes a lot more preparation to get where you want. However, if you look and balance the overall effort required, manufacturers probably should be paying more attention, not less, to the ongoing need of regulatory compliance in this later model. So these ongoing requirements include the submission of post-market adverse events reports, especially the annual reporting requirement for Class 2 and Class 3 devices. You obviously need to observe QMS requirements, the same way you do in Europe already. And CFDA has published guidelines on conducting unannounced risk-based factory audit. But even though the guidelines don't specify whether they're doing that in China or around the world, we haven't seen the practice of them going overseas to audit anyone lately yet. And CFDA also is in the habit of review particular groups of device or particular area. So as recent as last week, we have seen them starting a 5-month campaign on the foul play they see in the device registration as well as supplying process. If you want more detail, you can log on to our blog, which talks about which these 5 areas are and what you need to watch out for. And CFDA also is now doing a lot more random sampling in the marketplace. So they pick up your device from the hospital or the supply chain, wherever they may come and audit, and they take it for post-market testing to the Chinese standards applying to similar devices or the particular standard that applies to your device. So you have to make sure all the devices that you have in the market is compliant to the current registration certificate you have. Now, since we talk about post-market, and for most overseas manufacturers, non-Chinese manufacturers, keeping compliance in China means you need to cooperate with your local partners. Due to the vast size of China as a country, manufacturers need to engage multiple distributors for distribution to hospitals and clinics around the place. And because most hospitals are owned by the government, you need distributors to help you with public tendering process, as well as you need them for the regulatory compliance on that they have to hold the Chinese good distributors license. So that is a license that you get by keeping to the China GDP code. And China actually penalizes if they find out any distributor does not comply to this GDP practice. They not only penalize the distributor themselves, they also penalize any hospitals or clinics that uses unlicensed goods supplied from unlicensed distributors. So this means to protect your brand name in China, you really do need to watch out and work with reputable partners. Now, one thing you need to, it's of advantage is, unlike Australia, where the local sponsor holds your device registration, and switching the ownership of that registration in most cases needs the cooperation from your current sponsor. In China, you're not trapped with one distributor or one sponsor. You can actually quite easily assign the sponsorship to someone else if you find your current sponsor unsatisfactory. From time to time, we also hear horror stories coming out of China, which reminds us of the importance of maintaining good relationship with the government while doing business. Now, as an aside, I thought I would also share with you the modern channel of distribution that becomes really popular in China, which is online selling. So here on the screen, you see a Siemens, I think, hearing aid that has sold 1,000-something units per month from one online shop. And that is not bad, but do watch out for this blue box down the bottom here, where they have to certify, this online shop has to certify against the online pharmaceutical distribution practice. And this is something that CFDA is cracking down on. Enforcing online distribution of medical devices also meets the safety and effectiveness requirement. So to wrap up everything, we have seen the great effort China has put into harmonizing its regulatory processes, including the streamlining of its pre-market approval and certificate renewal process. At the same time, they also increased the amount of rigor they place on high-risk devices, giving more resources and attention to them. Now, a lot of these changes, keep in mind, they happened in the last 12 months. And combined with the high growth environment that we mentioned China is in, this means training for the reviewers have to play catch up over time. So we may be experiencing a bit of a bumpy ride on the way to harmonization. But with the commitment that Chinese government is putting into bring about international harmony to its device regulation, I think it would only be a matter of time until China can truly call itself an international marketplace. So with that, I hope you have enjoyed the webinar so far. And yeah, as previously mentioned, please do type your questions, and our staff here will be collating them, and we'll shortly start the question and answer session. Right, let me open up the questions here. Yep, so we have a question here from Tim. Given the defined timelines and limit of numbers of question cycles during review, do you expect to see a higher number of rejections as regulators strive to meet their time targets? i.e., is it easier to say no than complete the assessment? This is a good question because it does give way to how things typically work in China. So even though the timeline is quite rigid, there are a lot of common practices that we recommend to our clients who want to registration in China. For example, if you want to start your registration in China, don't wait until you submitted the dossier to talk to a reviewer. Because in China, a lot of expectations are not written down in technical guideline. It sits somewhere in the reviewer's head. So until you talk to them, you don't actually know how many, how they want to place that comma or full stop mark on your dossier. And we actually get a lot of value out of upfront negotiation and consultation with reviewers. What do you expect to see, for example, for this Class 2 device application? Is it okay to submit an overseas example, or do you want an China example? So we knock out a lot of those questions before we actually submit the dossier, and that actually minimizes your chance of being hit with a strict timeline, responding with 3 more additional testing. Having said that, of course, you don't always get the reviewer you talk to when you do the review process. So you do have to have a bit of a flexibility in terms of like what the example I gave during the talk, that additional type testing requirements. You need to have good reasons to come back to them on why you don't agree with some of the questions they ask, if you think that takes a long time and doesn't add to the safety and effectiveness level. And also the reviewers are, most cases we find, quite friendly in terms of they want to talk to you. If you already have an ongoing conversation and a good relationship with them, they're not going to throw out your dossier in your face and say, go away and come back with a document when you're ready. They'll actually be able to negotiate and help you towards meeting the requirements. So in short, I guess I don't expect to see a large increase of rejections all of a sudden if you follow the good practices. But if you're blindly going in with the dossier and expecting that or the question that could have be answered before the in the preparation stage be answered in the review, yeah, we don't expect. Then in that case, I think in that case only, you'll see a lot of rejections. Right. So another question from Joe is, any idea of the time necessary for innovative medical devices under the new path, or any commitment on CFDA side? Yeah, Joe, this is a very, very new announcement. I should mention it's, I think only a month ago they announced this. So it takes time, as I said, from some rules being put in place and the reviewers actually catch up to the practice of it. So it's not yet a well-oiled engine in terms of approving innovative medical devices. We don't really have a good grip of timeline because we haven't seen any devices going through and going down this pathway. But the intention is, if you have a product in the development phase, that is, you are well on track of getting your patent in China, then the intention is definitely to help you shorten the time. But to put a definitive months or years to that, I'm not able to do that at this stage. Right. So another question coming from Tim, is what happens if the review question requires more than the 60 days the manufacturer has to respond? So if you need to do additional biocompatibility testing, especially, does that mean rejection and start again? So I very briefly mentioned this, but I don't think it made sense during the presentation, is you are allowed with one extension. So you can request another 60 working day extension if you think that the initial 60-day default timeline is not enough. So in terms of testing, especially biocompatibility testing, sometimes 120 working days is still pushing it because of the queue that we mentioned of in China testing house. And in those circumstances, normally you would try to present them with overseas data or try to persuade them into accepting alternative evidence. But of course, if it's obvious that they requested an implant study that takes a whole year to complete, then they will probably reject you and expect you to come back when the testing is ready. But it's not as black and white as that. We don't, because this requirements is quite new since the beginning of the year or end of last year, around that period. We have seen a lot of rejections of things that's 5-6 years old. But if you only submitted in the past year or so, I think they are trying to not shock you with just a blank rejection. They will try to accommodate you in allowing you to negotiate on terms and timelines. Right. So moving down the list here, we have a question from Vaishnavi on does the FDA and the free sale certificate in own country essential? Is C design and C certificate enough? That really depends on your country of origin. So if your country of origin is the US and you only have an EC certificate, then FDA is unlikely, CFDA, sorry, is unlikely to be okay. Vice versa, if you're a European manufacturer, you do need to have your EC certificate, and a free sale certificate is not quite meeting the expectation. But yes, but that could be troublesome if you come, say, from New Zealand, where there is no formal approval of medical devices, and we've had cases where you have to explain to them that, yeah, in New Zealand you just don't get the equivalent of your EC certificate. Yep. Another question is from Pat Zhang. I'm interested in comments on the recent fraudulent activities with regards online sales channels for bogus medical device companies and the government's response to that issue. Yep. Yeah, so that's definitely a big thing that the government is trying to crack down on. I think we did have a blog article, correct me if you don't find anything on our website under the blogs, but I think I did write up something about that recent announcement they made on the, I think, 5 or so companies that was basically either faking they had a certificate, or they were faking the fact that they were selling a registered device, but it wasn't the actual device they were selling. So yeah, China is definitely trying to avoid, eliminate any foul play in terms of fraudulent activity with, especially with online sellers, because it's so much easier when you are online to, copy pictures and text from the legitimate seller. So yeah, that's something that they're trying to target. And here we have a question from Adele on any cases submitted by the simplified route for re-registration. I'm not sure if you're asking for personal experience or asking in general whether there have been cases now submitted for simplified routes. It's yeah. I guess I can talk about both. We are preparing the submission. It's again this re-registration is for simplified routes came out a few months ago. So before you might be doing testing and so on. Now you don't have to anymore. So it's just a case of compile your administrative documents and risk assessments and so on and so forth that you probably already have for Europe or other markets, and put that in front of CFDA. Yep. Okay. Here I have a question from Joe on any equivalent with 510K registration, such as equivalent to the registration process as 510K. Assuming you Joe meant by that the equivalent of establishing equivalence with a previously registered device. Now that's not quite the pathway that CFDA has chosen. So if I may use my Angry Bird model again, the big thing that you need to do for registration in China is type testing, and yeah, and I'm trying to think. I think having a very similar predicate helps if it's from the same company. But if you are trying to use other companies' models, then they may not help you any further than having the classification decided. Yep. Okay, so here I have a question from Gillian on the local registration. If a US or European manufacturer is registering a companion diagnostic solely intended for Chinese use, does the local regulation requirement still stand? This would be challenging if clinical trials were conducted only in China. Right. Okay, I'm trying to understand the intention here. And if a companion diagnostic only intended for Chinese use, there's a local regulation requirements. There's a local clinical trial requirements, you mean? Yep, I think. Right. Yeah, I think companion diagnostics are not quite the same as simple medical devices, so it may take a bit more to answer that question to actually understand it fully. So I might get back to you specifically about this question offline. Yep. Right, so I have a question from Tulushka here on, is it still a requirement to have a China-based representative? The answer is yes. So that's a common requirement, I think, in a lot of countries around the world, that you have to have an in-China sponsor. China is, yeah, it's quite, it's a bit unique in that you can have two agencies. One is your local market representative, the other is your after-sales agent. So the in-China sponsor, I think it's the one that, similar to your US EC's Europe representative, it needs to make sure your device is compliant to both post-market as well as negotiations during pre-market stage happens efficiently. And the after-sales agent is normally a role taken by your distributor in ensuring technical support and things like adverse events reporting are happening through to your customers in China. Yep. Okay. So here I have another question on do you need to conduct all the testing required? For example, that implant testing you mentioned that was required of you. So it depends on the stage of negotiation you are with CFDA. So for the implant study, I guess we were lucky because we have an in-house expert on biocompatibility that Dr. Arthur Brand would actually sit on the panel for ISO 10993 standards. So he can speak from an expert point of view on why the device is safe and effective by demonstrated by the existing biocompatibility tests. But if you are talking to the technical reviewers before making a submission and they give you a list of tests, it's hard to argue against until you have made a submission and you can talk to an individual reviewer. So normally in the preparation stage, if you're given a list of testing that they're expecting, we would recommend do all of them. But if in the review phase you have an unexpected request for a test that you believe is not applicable, then we normally try to push back. Right. So here I have a question from Kim. I'm working in foreign manufacturer. You mentioned the manufacturer, not distributor, must have the GDP, a good distribution practice. Please let me know more detail about the good distribution practice. Right. I think it might be a mistake on my part if I mentioned the manufacturer must hold GDP, because it is your in-China partner who has to have the license for distribution of medical products in China, and they get that license by demonstrating they are compliant with the Chinese GDP practice. So as a manufacturer, your role is more in choosing the right distributor to work with. So you have a look at their GDP license, make sure it does exist and it's not expiring tomorrow, and also that you do want to have a feel of their knowledge of the regulatory requirements, simply because in the regulatory requirements it does mean that you need to know the adverse events that normally comes through your distributor in a given time frame and collate them for the annual reporting. So you want to work with a partner that can help you meeting the regulatory requirements ongoing. As I mentioned, because of the post-market random sampling that CFDA does, if you find a distributor that for one reason or another failed to meet the CFDA expectation, they will be publishing the distributor's name, but your product name may be associated with that, and you don't want bad publicity that way. So in that way, I think that's where your role and your interest as a manufacturer lie. Right. I think we have time for one last question here, and if your question have been submitted but not yet covered during the stage, we can actually come back to you offline. So yeah, so don't panic if your question is not picked as a lucky last. Right. So here I have a question from Megan. You mentioned that clinical trial of devices must be performed in China. What about non-clinical tests, such as biocompatibility tests? Do those need to be done in China as well? And are there any approved tests or testing labs in the United States? Right, so so to answer that question, I may refer back to my previous mention of the Chinese product standard dossier that you draft and from your technical file overseas, but you actually make reference to the local guidelines and industrial standards. In the same way that because your product standards exist in Chinese, the CFDA expects that to be verified by China testing house. So those are very specific authorized testing houses that you can find in China. Normally they wouldn't let you use foreign reports. There are exceptions to that rule for some non-clinical tests, I think, such as the for big multi-story radiology equipment. They allow you to do the in-China testing after you actually imported and implemented a device, a unit of the device. But yeah, for most of the non-clinical testings, including most of the biocompatibility tests, they actually do expect to see the results in China. But because the tests are done by different in-China testing houses, so some, depending on the one that you chose, some of them will have the equipment and will willingly conduct the whole range of them, whereas some of them are willing to adopt whatever Western standards or Western reports that you can give them. So you do have to look at it as a case-by-case one. Okay, great. We're running out of time here, so thank you for listening and thank you for participating in the question and discussion session. If your question has been submitted, we will get back to you by email. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy a great day. Okay, bye.